infects a swarm of wasps, they begin to mutate into giant creatures that kill everything in their path. Julia owns a catering company handed down by her late father. Paul works for her, and together they set up a function at Perch Estates. The road to the venue is quite bumpy, which causes Julia to spill coffee on herself. She changes her shirt while talking about feeling anxious about running the business, and Paul can't help but be distracted by her assets. Later, they arrive at the estate, and Julia takes Paul's phone to ensure that he'd focus on the job. Just then, Flora, Julia's family friend, welcomes them into the mansion. While Julia works in the kitchen with Flora, Paul sets up the tables in the garden. There, he meets Larry, the event's entertainer. Larry notices that Paul is looking a little glum, so he plays a special piece for him while he works. Meanwhile, Flora expresses her sympathies regarding Julia's father. She also reassures her that she'll live up to his expectations and everything will work out. After this, they notice Paul from the garden, who's trying to impress Julia with his juggling tricks. Flora tells Julia that he likes her, but she replies that she'd rather jump off a cliff than get with him. Later on, Sidney Perch, the son of the estate's owner, approaches Paul and asks him to keep his personal stash of alcohol safe. He worries that people might drink it since it's very expensive. He then asks Paul if he wants to have a beer with him, to which the man discreetly agrees. Just then, someone calls Sidney, asking if he's seen Percy, the family dog. Meanwhile, Percy starts digging a hole in the ground before scurrying away. With this, Sidney immediately hands the beer to Paul and chases after Percy. Paul then resumes his work, but a wasp suddenly flies by him and causes him to topple over a chair. Infuriated, he tries killing the insect, but only ends up breaking the glasses close to it. Julia then appears and reminds Paul to be professional. Meanwhile, Paul is cautious about his surroundings because of the wasp, and he even tells Julia to warn Sidney about it. Just then, Julia notices the injury on Paul's leg, so she tells him where the first aid kit is. She also tosses him the van's keys, telling him to move the vehicle to the back of the house. Julia's lack of concern pisses Paul off, and he sarcastically imitates her voice as soon as she leaves. After this, he moves the van and mends his wound. He also changes his pants, which are too big for him. Before he returns to the garden, he notices a greenhouse nearby, so he decides to check it out. There, he meets Mrs. Perch, who's out looking for Percy. She compliments him for his good looks, which reminds her of her late husband. However, the two don't get to talk much as the guests start arriving. That night, the party goes on as planned. As Paul keeps serving drinks at the bar, a married woman shows interest in him, but she reassures him that she's almost divorced. Julia sees this, so she casually approaches Paul and jokes about the situation. Just then, Mayor Carruthers asks for a drink. He compliments their food, then tells the two that they make for a good pair. As he returns to his colleagues, Carruthers keeps hearing insect sounds, and so does Paul. Suddenly, Paul spots a wasp, so he squashes it. Just then, Larry approaches him, devilishly asking if he wants to get a little high. The two then sneak out to smoke, but when Paul notices a creepy gynecologist bothering Julia, he immediately goes to her. Later on, Sidney gives an awkward speech to his guests. Meanwhile, the wasps are starting to get more bothersome, and one even lands on Sidney's back. As he finishes his speech, a woman suddenly screams, pleading for help. When Paul rushes over, he sees a man having a seizure, and he also has an insect bite on his face. As he's about to help, the man flips himself over and starts bending his body in unlikely positions. Suddenly, everyone hears the sound of insects growing louder. To their horror, a horde of wasps emerges from the hole that Percy dug. Paul then screams at everyone to get inside the mansion at once. Amid all the chaos, the wasps start burrowing themselves into the guests' bodies. Then they emerge as creatures 100 times their size. As Paul and Julia try to leave the venue, they find themselves face to face with a woman who fancied Paul, whose body now serves as a host to the parasitic wasps. Paul almost gets eaten, but Julia covers the giant wasp with a tablecloth, allowing them to escape. Flora calls out for them to get into the mansion. However, she attracts the attention of the giant wasp, and she almost gets eaten. Luckily, Percy distracts the insect. Julia and Paul then seek refuge in the mansion while the guests get consumed. They immediately head to the kitchen, where Mayor Carruthers, Mrs. Perch, and Sidney are waiting. There, they agree to call for help, but because there's no cell service, Sidney takes Julia and Paul to the office where the telephone is. Meanwhile, the others remain in the kitchen. When the three get to the office, they realize that the telephone is no longer functional. Just then, they notice a car's headlights flashing outside, and to their horror, they witness someone mutate inside the vehicle. vehicle. Just then, someone bangs on the office's window, and it's Larry. He pleads with Paul to let him in, but Sydney prevents them from helping him. Suddenly, two giant wasps gather around Larry, and he gets devoured before the trio's eyes. Julia argues with Sydney that they could have saved him, but he replies that he won't risk it since Larry might have been stung. On the other hand, Paul is more focused on surviving, and he asks Sydney if they have a cellar or a basement they can hide in. Sydney then grabs the keys to the cellar, although he thinks hiding is a dumb idea. Suddenly, someone screams from the kitchen, and when they get there, they witness Flora soaked in her own blood. It turns out that Mrs. Perch has been stung, and she's slowly mutating into a giant wasp. As she's about to attack Sydney, he punches her and escapes with the others. They close the door to the kitchen, and Flora immediately rests before it. However, the wasp kicks its sharp stinger through the door, and it pierces through her, ultimately killing her. Paul tries to help her, but the wasp grabs him with its legs. Luckily, Julia stabs the insect while Carruthers helps pull him away. With this, the survivors immediately head to the basement. However, they stop in their tracks when they hear a roar, which then summons the swarm of giant wasps in the garden. The insects then break into the house while Sydney still figures out which key to use. He manages to find it at the last minute, allowing the group to be momentarily safe. As they try to figure out their next move, Carruthers grabs a bottle of wine, and Paul helps him open it with a special trick. Carruthers then notices how Paul looks at Julia, so he shares his frustrations about her only seeing him as a mere employee. He expresses that she's never thankful, so Carruthers reassures him that Julia is only holding up because she's afraid. Meanwhile, Julia sees an old family portrait of Sydney and his parents. He comments that his parents never liked him, and he's just seen as a hassle and a freak. Julia then says she's sorry for everything that's happened. Then she joins Paul and Carruthers. As she leaves, Sydney flexes his arm, noticing that it feels slightly painful. Carruthers compliments Paul for his heroic act since the chaos ensued. He then stands to grab another bottle of wine while Julia starts a conversation with Paul. They joke about considering the wasp attack as their job's overtime, leading Paul to say he'll use the money to buy a VW Bug. He adds that he'll travel through all of the US states, even Hawaii. On the other hand, Sydney is starting to feel excruciating pain, and he's just minutes away from mutating. Just then, the ceiling shakes from all the wasp's movements. Carruthers then wonders what caused all this mess, and Sydney reveals that it's a mutation that he thinks is caused by a fertilizer he made. He adds that he used some hormone-infused growth fertilizers in it. This angers Julia, but the others focus more on escaping. Paul then remembers the van, but then he realizes that he dropped the keys. He reckons that it's in the garden, so he volunteers to retrieve it. Julia doesn't want him to go alone, but Paul tells her to stay with the others. Later on, Paul sneaks into the garden, and he grabs an ice pick before successfully retrieving the keys. He then spots Percy, so he tries to call him before he returns to the basement. However, the dog starts shivering, and it turns out that he's been stung. Meanwhile, Sydney starts his mutation, and a wasp's head emerges from his shoulder. As Carruthers tries to protect himself and Julia, Paul struggles to fight the wasp outside. When he manages to kill the insect with the ice pick, he hears Julia scream from the basement. He immediately busts into the basement's window, only to be greeted by Sydney, who's almost finished mutating. Paul quickly smashes his face with a shovel, and together with Carruthers, they push a shelf over Sydney. Although their current crisis is averted, they must figure out how to get to the van. With this, the three slowly make their way through the house. As they cautiously try to escape, they almost get spotted by a lone wasp. Because of this, they're forced to hide against the wall, and as they do, Paul holds Julia's hand to reassure her. Just then, the wasp flies off, allowing the three to continue their escape. Later, they find an exit but are unsure where it leads. Carruthers volunteers to check it out, but then a wasp suddenly drags him into the exit's opening. Paul and Julia try to help him, but Carruthers screams at them to leave. Julia gets hysterical, so Paul drags her to safety. However, her cries summon one of the wasps, and now they're cornered. Carruthers then grabs a fire extinguisher and makes the wasp stab it. The explosion allows Paul and Julia to escape. As they run through the halls, the surviving wasp still pursues them. They get into a room in time and barricade it with a table. They immediately try to find an exit, but the windows are nailed shut. Stuck, the two hide under the table and talk about what'll happen if they survive. They agree that they might change careers and work in Hawaii because they both like being warm. Talking about warmth, Paul says he likes cuddles, which leads him to casually ask Julia if she likes making out. Julia then shoots him a knowing look, but just before they can kiss, a wasp smashes through the door. The two keep quiet, but when Julia accidentally sneezes, the wasp smashes its leg through the table. It injures Julia on the shoulder, so Paul grabs the insect's legs and signals her to flip the table over. She then grabs a chair and smashes the wasp's head, which kills it. Out of panic, she doesn't stop until Paul calms her down. Overwhelmed with adrenaline, the two almost kiss, but the ceiling above them starts to crack. Dozens of the wasp's legs start shooting out of it, so Paul and Julia take this as their cue to leave. However, a wasp lies waiting at every corner they get to. After running for a while, they find a hole in the wall that leads outside in broad daylight. Before they can leave though, a wasp spots them, so they immediately make a run for it. As they reach the greenhouse, the wasp catches up to them. It attacks Paul, piercing its giant stinger through his shoulder. Julia then grabs Paul's ice pick and starts stabbing the wasp's stinger until it falls off. This frees Paul, but the wasp sends Julia flying off into the distance, knocking her unconscious. Later on, she wakes up and desperately crawls to a safe corner. There, she breaks down, realizing that Paul is dead and she might be next. However, she suddenly hears Paul screaming, so she immediately gets up and follows the sound of his voice. Elsewhere, Paul gets taken to a nest where Sydney holds him captive. It turns out that Sydney's mutation is not like everyone else's, and he merely has a small wasp head on his arm, which controls his mind. He then grabs the stinger from Paul's shoulder, which causes immense pain. He then explains that the wasp that emerged from Mrs. Perch is the queen, and she wants Paul to swallow one of her larvae to be incubated in his body. Helpless, Paul tries talking to Sydney's consciousness, telling him that his mother is using him. Sydney almost concedes, but the queen forces him to do his job. Then, just before the larva gets forced into Paul's mouth, Julia runs an electric saw through Sydney's body. This allows her to free Paul, and she also uses the saw to scare the queen. As they slowly back away, Sydney curses at the queen, so she squashes him dead. Meanwhile, Julia cuts a tube that releases gas into the nest. Then she and Paul immediately head to the van. She tells him to drive while she lights up one of the fertilizers and throws it into the nest full of wasps. As they drive away, the whole place catches on fire, and the mansion crumbles as it explodes. The two rejoice over their successful escape, but their joy is short-lived when the queen chases after them. Despite being on fire, it furiously seeks to kill. As the queen tries to reach them through the windshield, Paul tells Julia to jump out of the car while he sacrifices himself. However, Julia refuses, so together they hold hands as they crash the car into a tree to kill the wasp. Later, Paul wakes up to the dead wasp and an unconscious Julia. He then musters all his strength to try and wake her up, but she doesn't seem to be responding. However, after he forcibly shakes and slaps her, she regains consciousness. The authorities and the medics then pass by them, and they immediately receive medical care. After this, they awkwardly sit in silence in the ambulance. However, they catch on to the tension between them and copulate in the vehicle. The officer who's about to ask for a statement ends up closing the ambulance door to give them privacy. Meanwhile, one of the officers notices the wasp in front of the van. Just then, a cow's head falls from the sky and crushes his skull. Everyone in the scene then looks up to see wasp and cow hybrids flying in the sky. As the insects fly into the distance, the fate of humanity is left unknown.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel.